Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Joined right now by Steve Nicholson. He is the Global Sector Strategist for Grains and Oilseeds with Rabobank. Steve, great to have you here on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sean. Good to see you at Grow Canada.
Yeah, it was a fabulous presentation. I wish
Thank
I
you.
had all of those slides behind me when it was very, very informative. I really do appreciate some of the data that you
Thank you.
shared with the delegates. I guess overall right now, when I talk to people that are analyzing what's happening fundamentally or even technically in the global grain sector, I find that the majority believe that are more on the bearish side at this moment.
Yeah.
Now, in your presentation, you gave some reflections and some thoughts on, wait a minute here, there's maybe a little bit more to the upside argument than maybe some are arguing. Sum that up first. Why do you believe that?
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. The market has turned right, wrong, or different. All of 23 has been bearish, and everyone seems to be leaning that way. And and fundamentally, it seems like that to me, and I'm going to put corn and soybeans on the side because corn and soybeans, there's no question when you look at stocks and you look at that there is a bearish tinge there and there's not a lot of upside potential, but also not a lot of downside. But the market has turned, extremely bearish on everything. They just don't want to own anything. They just want to sell it. And this is going to be the way we are. But that's divorced from the fundamentals, as we said about corn and soybeans. But you start to look at wheat, for example, and you look at the stocks. I don't care if it's in Canada, the United States, or wherever in the world, among the exporters, you're down to where in the top in the bottom 25, bottom quartile of stocks. And so you look at that and think, well, that's interesting. The wheat market's heading down and stocks are heading down. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. And so, and and then you think about what's happening in the wheat market. Obviously, it was dry in Canada this year. It was dry last year in Canada. It's been dry in Argentina. It's been dry in Europe, although Europe had a better crop. Ukraine put a better crop on the table than we thought they were going to be able to put on the table this year. But the big story has been Russia just continues to dump cheap grain on the world, and that only happened so long. But the fundamentals seem divorced from the market action, and it's also a technical, it's sort of self-fulfilling. Well, I'm just going to sell it, and it just keeps going down, so that's the right trade. Until we could get a whole philosophical discussion on the board and how the board's structured, but when you have the volume that's going that direction, technically it looks very, very bearish. At some point, those will have to come together because the market will go, oh, I can't buy my wheat anymore, for example.
Now, one old rule that I had heard was of course, we live by these, right?
Yes, of
We,
course.
we don't want the wheat market to lead us higher. We need corn to lead us higher, and that's one of the
Right.
ones that is showing some weakness, even
Yeah.
relative to beans. That isn't that kind of the dark cloud that sort of hangs over this whole complex?
Yeah, that's the other challenge, of course, is corn tends to lead the complex up or down. And when you have corn, and I'm looking at the board here to my side, as soon as you see, corn goes down, wheat goes down as well. And so, wheat rarely leads the complex higher. You had a little bit of that, of course, after the war. And, we saw wheat lead everybody up because of the challenge of Ukraine and Russia and movement of grain. But, I think as you go forward and think about that, Russia will continue to move, wheat out because there are people in the world, India and China, for example, who will buy it, or Middle East because it's cheap. But the fact is, Ukraine is going to have less opportunity to move wheat or grain out of the country. It's going to be tougher to do it, and we've already seen those reflections where they were moving upwards of 4 to 6 million metric tons a month. Now they're moving 1.5 million metric tons a month. And granted, it's a lot of corn, but that's not going to be available to the world market. And then if you start to think about, okay, so if the exporters have a smaller stock level, well, where's all that wheat at, for example? It's all in China. 52% of the world wheat's in China. And, last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, China came to North America and bought, wheat out of the United States. And you're like, what's that all about?
Yeah.
And so that gets that kind of raises your antenna to think two things. One is they have a quality issue, or, and I think this is the latter. I think this is also as important, is that the milling quality wheat available in the world is just not there. There's a lot of feed wheat available, but not much milling quality wheat. And I think as we get to the back half of this crop year, as we come into January, the world will start to think, oh gosh, where am I? I don't have any milling quality wheat. Where am I going to come? And so that's where you think about the North American continent. You think about Canada, the United States has that milling quality wheat. Europe has some, but again, they had some issues as well this year. So wheat is, will wheat lead us higher? Likely not, but you're going to see it in the cash market come back.
Yeah. And also I do wonder a little bit on that China purchase, the timing of
Yeah,
it with connected with the continued dry bias that we're seeing, through the U.S. corn or sorry, the U.S. wheat belt, all like you mentioned,
yep,
all the way through Western Canada. We
yeah,
need some moisture. And
yep.
it could also be a little bit of a case of you mentioned the quality from a quality standpoint, get the wheat while it's available in case this pattern doesn't change.
Yeah, and I think, China is also, let's be honest, China are very smart traders. Don't ever discount them.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. The premise of your question is correct. China, I think, worries about what am I going to be able to get next year? And I think when they looked at, Brazilian soybeans, they saw got concerned both about the logistics in Brazil because it's been very dry in the northern arc. And they thought, gosh, we need to get some soybeans, so we'll come to the US and get some. And the same thing with wheat. Wow, it's dry in the North American continent. We don't know what Europe will look like. The prices have come down. We better grab some before they go back up because farmers are going to say, you know what, I'm not going to plant wheat this year. I'm going to plant something else because the price isn't there or the
Yeah.
margin's not there, I should say.
So
So,
what's your crystal ball? And not like you're a fortune teller, you're actually doing analysis and not looking at tarot
yeah.
cards. But what about the oilseed sector? Soybeans, canola, the veg oil complex. Canola was like a darling for as
Oh,
the rest of
gosh.
the
Yeah.
market went down. But what's your thoughts on the oilseeds?
Yeah, that's the thing that's a bit of a mystery to me about what's happening with oil seeds is I think it's caught in this. There's actually two things happening. It's caught in this bearish, as we just talked at the top, this bearish move down. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that, and you look at the board, people have been buying meal and selling oil. And again, that trade has continued to work, and so they continue to bull spread that meal oil. And so, oil is the dog of that complex because meal keeps being held up. And that's partly because Argentina is not shipping and US exports of meal and protein meal out of the North American continent have been very strong. But at some point, when you start to look at the biofuel sector and look at what's happening as far as the demand, it's not going away. And people want to talk about RIN values and all this. But you look at the demand for biodiesel, I'm sorry, renewable diesel,
Yeah.
and then you have SAF out here, starting to grow as well. I just don't think. And oh, by the way, El Nino is happening in across the globe, and palm oil could be in a situation as we get halfway through mid-year next year that we don't see the palm oil production, and all of a sudden you're going to have again a shortage or a very very tight vegetable oil S&D across the globe that you're going to have to deal with. And so I think it's the oil seed will come back. It's just you're going to have to wait it out a little bit to see that happen. And frankly, this is, canola is the one because it's 42% oil content. That we need that oil content, so we need more canola in the globe.
Yeah, if we could actually get a relatively stable amount of rain in the northern tier of the U.S., we could see a real bump in canola production because it is preferred feedstock when it comes to renewable diesel because of that oil content that you talked about. We got a change in leadership in Argentina, and I
Yep.
talk, and maybe it's happened, but talk about maybe removing some of the tariffs on exporting soybeans, and obviously they've made a big adjustment to their Argentinian peso.
Yeah.
How does this change? How do we view this through the commodity complex lens?
Yeah. And this is all happening as we're talking today. Almost real time.
Yeah.
Um, it certainly puts Argentina in a much more competitive space as far as if you're a foreign buyer looking at that and going, oh, that's devalued, we better buy that, so on and so forth. So I do think it does take a little bit of it takes some of the, what should we say, the upside potential out of the oilseed complex because now Argentina will will try to move some of that, their soy or their meal and oil onto the global market. But I think the challenge is they don't have it either. But as we get, the other thing is the market's already starting to think about next year or 2024, thinking, well, Argentina will have a normal soybean crop, and so they'll be back in the market selling meal and oil. And I think that's part of the market's anticipating that already and kind of, I won't say betting on it, but thinking that that's going to happen so that we don't need to rally oilseed prices or oil or meal at this point because Argentina will be back. So this just helps us by reducing the value of the peso.
Okay. Ukraine, the war there has kind of, the funding of Ukraine in Canada and the US, that takes up some of the news oxygen, but the
Yep.
actual war itself is sort of left, the news doesn't lead with it anymore. But
Yeah.
what's happening there is still having an impact on the fundamentals of what's happening in commodities. You addressed that in your presentation at Grow Canada. Talk
Yeah.
about your perspective there.
Yeah. So, let's set the funding situation aside for now, and we could come
Yep.
back to that. But, the fact is that, when you start to look at production in Ukraine over the last couple of years from the peaks, you're talking 25, 30% drop in, area planted, harvested production. And I would suspect as we get into 24 that we're going to see another dip in that production just because the war has continued on, whether it's, un, unexploded ammunition or ordnance, trenches, compaction of soil, uh, all the things that we've seen will just continue to be a case there. And it does appear that the war is sort of at a bit of a stalemate right now. So, and as we talked a minute ago, with Ukraine not able to move, you know, 3 to 6 million metric tons a month, that really takes, that basically takes a lot of product off the global market. That's good for Canada. That's good for the United States to be able to move product into the global market. But you don't want to dance on someone's grave, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But
Yeah.
that fundamental is not going to get better anytime soon. And we talk about dryness. It's been dry in Russia as well, and in Ukraine, surprisingly, even though it had been dry this year, came out with a pretty good crop. So we'll see what 24 brings, but I'm not optimistic that it'll be a good sized crop there for those producers or for the world to get a hold of.
Now, at the same time, though, isn't it kind of surprising with all of that going on, what they have produced and the
Oh,
other side of that is what they have shipped? Like
yeah,
it kind of is a mind blow. Like when you really think about it, it is astonishing.
absolutely. I mean, I got a chance to speak to a group in Kiev in the middle of my night, and I wasn't in the room, and I wish I could have been, but that's, this time it's not a good thing to go to Kiev these days.
Yeah.
But it's in the room, you could just feel the optimism, the resolve that we're going to do this and we're going to get this done because this is what we do. And that is an astonishing piece. Um, I think no one can ignore. And I think that's the other thing that, the Russians are doing this because this is what Putin wants, and no one really understands why we're doing this, and they don't have the passion. But the Ukrainians, you are attacking my home country, and I'm going to protect my home country, and we don't care who you are, we're going to do that. That has not gone away, and I think that's a remarkable trait and a remarkable thing to keep in mind. Um, they're not going to go quiet, and they certainly haven't, because we're approaching a 2 year battle here in February 24 of 24. That to me, when people said, oh, this will be done in 4 or 5 days, here we are almost 2 years down the road and it's still going.
Yeah, I remember there was a political analyst,
Yeah.
Olivier Knox, who I can't remember where he is now, but at the time he was with Sirius XM, and
Okay.
he mentioned that this has the writings of a long war of attrition written all over it, and
Absolutely.
boy, does that seem real at this point.
Yeah. And that it is a war of attrition. Um, Granted, there's more people in Russia than probably is Ukraine, but the Ukrainians are not going to give up. And I think for people around the globe, and for those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War, is that where we want to go back to again? I don't think so. That was not good for anybody. That was a use of resources that was not used for other things. It was all used for military. And I think we have to consider that. And if Russia takes Ukraine, let's just say that, then you start to see the domino effect in those frontline states in Europe. And if you talk to Europeans, they're scared to death of that. And I think we all should be as well.
Steve, whether you're to wrap up here, whether you're bullish or you're bearish,
Yeah.
what's one of the key signals, the indicators that we really need to be following here as we move into 24 here very shortly?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, and we talked
Yep.
about them at Grow Canada. I think one, of course, is the weather. Now, the weather is going to, people can say, oh, if it rains, everything's good. But we have a huge soil deficit that we have, soil moisture deficit we have to make up. And so anything that rains is going to be soaked in immediately because the soil needs it. So I think the weather and soil moisture is crucial. I think the other thing for producers, both for buyers and sellers, you're going to have a lot of volatility within a fairly narrow range of price movement. And so I think as you get rallies need to be rewarded as a seller. And at the same time, sell-offs need to be rewarded by buyers because I think you're at this, you could say a little bit sort of the analogy with Russia and Ukraine. The market's a bit of a standoff. Is that, the bears are still in control, but how much more bearish news can you get? I mean, what are you going to tell me that's going to be extremely bearish other than Argentina produces a record crop, Brazil produces a record crop, and the U.S. produces a record crop in 2024. Uh, but I don't know that that's, is that all in the cards? And as our South American analyst said, I am less sure about what the production will look like in Brazil this year than I've been in a couple of years.
Mm.
So, I think those things, it's going to be very difficult to find bearish news that's going to propel this market even lower from where it is today. The demand domestically, whether you're in Canada, the United States, or Europe, or wherever, that demand is very, very strong. And that's the other piece is that domestic demand makes there's less available for export because domestic demand, whether it's for livestock, whether it's for processing, is very, very strong. And so countries will be shipping out, using or exporting what I would call more value-added products from a processing perspective. So I
Yeah.
think those are three things I'm watching very carefully.
Yeah, you mentioned renewable diesel. That's an example where it's a shift. We may be North America exporting less canola, less soybeans, but the meal's got to go somewhere. There's
Right.
going to be a
And
lot.
that's the big worry is where's the meal going to go for? And I think that's a valid worry.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, if let's pick on China, because they're easy to pick on in the sense of they're a big customer. If they find cheap meal, they're going to be all over that and be willing to ship, buy that and use that protein meal for their livestock because it's cheaper than buying the beans, processing the beans. Now, will that last? We'll see. But I also think as we see the increase in meal and of course the setback in prices a little bit, you'll start to see a rationalization of some of those older processing facilities across the North American continent because I don't care if it's a new canola processing plant or a new soybean crushing plant, the newer is going to be much more efficient than the older plants. And that we'll see some rationalization, which will help bring supply back in line with demand and also bring prices back in line and bring margins back for the crusher.
Steve, this has been fantastic. We got to chat more often. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Great insight, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Sean. Good to talk to you.